Welcome to this compilation of 4 psychological sci-fi short stories. I'll be narrating Journey for the Brave by Alan E. Nourse, Games by Katherine MacLean, The Spicy Sound of Success by Jim Harmon, and Captain Peabody by Phillips. If you aren't already, consider watching or listening on Substack. I'm publishing a lot more there now, with the platform offering a more stable, ad-free environment. You can get 3 free stories a week there, as well as extra for those who want to contribute more. Head to storiesfromthesky.sff.substack.com for all that in video, audio, and podcast form, link in the description. But for now, let's get to the stories. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Journey for the Brave by Alan E. Nourse, narrated by William Sky. Courage will be a big qualification for the pilot who flies the first moon rocket. But who decides if a man is brave or a coward? The base diner was hot and stuffy that night as Scotty Johnson sat with Mitch and Jack and the other boys, sipping his last cup of coffee before 0 hour rolled around. Mitch and Jack had succeeded in sneaking him out of town before the reporters had guessed what was happening. Now they sat in silence, sipping their coffee, glancing at him from time to time as though to make sure he was still there. It annoyed Scotty. This was the time to laugh and joke and bull away as if nothing was going to happen at all. The waitress trotted over with a coffee pot and Scotty gave her his widest leer. "You know, I can't think of anything I'd rather have right now than a cup of coffee from you," he said. "How about a date in 10 days? The girl looked startled and glanced away nervously. Mitch gave a tight little laugh. "Better watch out, Scotty. She's liable to be waiting on the landing field when you get back." They all laughed at that, and then silence fell again. They were nervous. Scotty could sense it, even though they tried to cover it up. All through these weeks of preparation in the hot New Mexico sun, the tension had been growing. But he should be the one to be nervous, not these lads. After all, who was the star of this show? Scotty nuzzled his coffee and twisted his wiry 5'2" frame around so that he could see the door. "Better drink up," he said. "The Jeep should be here any minute." Mitch nodded and emptied his cup as the Jeep's tires screeched on the pavement outside. The door of the coffee shop burst open, and a head with an MP's crash helmet popped in. "All set, Scotty? Let's go." Scotty nodded. His blue eyes were bright as he buttoned up his jacket and winked at the waitress. Then he led the group to the door. "Love that gal," he said. The driver raced the motor as they piled in, and the Jeep took off down the concrete strip with a roar. The driver turned an admiring glance towards Scotty. "All set for the big trip, man?" Scotty grinned. "Been sleeping in a coffin all week just for practice." "Man, you may need that practice. You'll be good and stiff before you get out." He broke off, horrified at the pun. Scotty roared with glee. "You think you're kidding? That's all right. The way I see it, I'm getting 10 days vacation on the government and plenty of pay besides. And once I get up there, I won't need much muscle to make my way around, they tell me." He lit a cigarette, peering down the strip ahead of them. Far ahead he could see the batteries of searchlights picking out the tall, shiny spire of the ship. It stood tall in its scaffolding, pointing like a needle toward the black, starlit sky. Already the ground below it was swarming with tiny figures, moving about on the final checkdown. My ship, thought Scotty. I helped to build it. And here's one job where they need a cocky, loud-mouthed little shrimp more than anything else in the world. Another Jeep swerved in beside them on the strip. Scotty caught a glimpse of the general and a couple of official-looking civilians. "Everybody's going to see you off," said Mitch from the back seat. "Yeah, the whole damned crowd. My big day." "You sure you got everything down cold?" Scotty gave him a scornful glance. "You kidding? How could I miss?" His freckled face broke into a grin from ear to ear and his eyes were bright with excitement. Why, I've got nothing to do but crawl in and zip things up after me. Don't even have to throw the fatal switch. They take care of everything from outside. I'm telling you, it's a cinch. 3 days to tell myself sea stories, and then I'll crawl out and tell you boys what Lady Moon really looks like." A crowd of reporters and photographers were waiting as the jeep sped up to the huge barbed wire enclosure surrounding the ship. Scotty stuck his head out of the jeep and gave them a big grin. The flashbulbs popped. Then the jeep roared on toward the field shack. Scotty stepped out, staring up at the tall, sleek ship. A little bottom-heavy now, perhaps, but with the first and second stages disengaged, a beauty of a ship. He stepped into the field shack and grinned up at the general. "Final check go all right?" The general nodded and smiled. "This is the Secretary of Defense, Scotty." "Well, guess I'm rating big visitors tonight." He gave the man's hand a jaunty shake. "You're taking a big trip," said the secretary. "Tell me, Mr. Johnson, how does it feel to be the first man to go to the moon?" "Can't say. I haven't been there yet." "You'd better get aboard," said the general. "Everything's been checked down. You'll have half an hour to make your own checks from inside. How's your weight?" "Down to 128. "Fine. That's better than we'd hoped. But don't be afraid to holler if something doesn't look right." He extended his hand, gripped Scotty's tightly. "Good luck, lad. We're with you all the way." A soldier rode up the gantry with him, high up past the brake lines of the first and second stages to the small open port in the final stage of the rocket. Scotty could feel the eyes on him from below as he climbed into the port. One lone man to jockey the first manned ship to the moon. A big job, a job that really took guts. He grinned and slid through into the passenger chamber. Carefully he reached back and slammed the port shut behind him with a farewell wave to the soldier and gave the lock wheel a spin until he heard the seal click. Then he slipped down into the half-sitting, half-reclining couch which nearly filled the tiny chamber. His heart was pounding in his throat as he snapped on the radio phone. "Okay, I'm in," he said. "Got her locked up?" Mitch's voice grated in his earphones. "Aye, aye. Give her a careful check inside there. Then stand by." Scotty nodded and checked the banks of instruments on the tiny panel before him. He was the payload on this trip. The ship was little more than an upholstered tube, with him jammed tight in one end, and enough fuel to land him on the moon and shoot him off again in behind him. The other sections, far huger than this little pellet with him in the middle, would drive him out, break the frightful hold that Earth held on her subjects. But there was nothing superfluous here, nothing he did not actually need, and he checked quickly. Then he leaned back and flicked on the forward televiewer. The vast black expanse of space, peppered with 1,000 bright pinpoints of light, suddenly appeared on the screen inches from his face. It took him by surprise. His hand jerked down on the switch again, and he wiped a line of droplets from his upper lip and closed his eyes, his heart pounding against his ribs. The radio blipped in his ear. 30 minutes to 0, it said. It struck Scotty Johnson then how very much alone he was. He felt a chill go down his spine and he turned his eyes about the tiny chamber. Forward, within arm's length, was the dull glint of metal panelling and coiled wires and tight atmosphere ceiling. His small wiry body sank against the deep couch and he drew the safety webbing across his chest and thighs, the chill in his mind deepening. Above him was another pad of soft material to protect his head. His feet were lodged against a solid bar at the foot of the couch. Inevitably he thought of a cocoon, a tight, soft, warm cocoon, and he was alone inside it. He tried to think when, in all his 34 years, he had been so completely and utterly alone. He sat very still, listening. All about him was silence, a muted, deathly silence. His headset pressed tight against his ears and he shook his head, wondering if he had actually heard the words coming into his ears a few seconds before. 0 minus 30 minutes. 30 minutes to wait, alone. Suddenly he knew that he was very much afraid. His lips formed a sneer, and he tried to fight the idea out of his mind. He was no longer afraid of anything. Those days were gone, far away. Nothing could scare Scotty Johnson, not even being completely alone. He reached out his hand, ran a finger over the control board. Oxygen, chamber pressure, emergency anesthetic, blast control. His hand trembled and the thought seeped back into his mind again. A voice was whispering deep in his ear. "You're afraid, little man. Afraid!" He could feel the droplets of moisture forming on his forehead, and even the sound of his breath was muted in the silent chamber. The seconds ticked by. Still the voice whispered. He was alone and afraid. No one could help him now, no one in the world. This was his own world, here in this tight little cabin, and he could die here and nobody would ever know. He shook his head savagely. Alone? Ridiculous. At the foot of the ship were 100 people, all watching, all thinking about him. They had built this ship, they were for him all the way. They would get him safely off the ground, and then it would be just like a subway ride. But after the blast-off, what then? The 100 men were staying behind. There were no men where he was going. There was nothing there. Nothing but death. His breath was coming faster, and he felt the first chill of panic stir in his mind. He tried to fight it down angrily. What was there to get excited about? Nobody had forced him into this seat. He'd begged for it. For 5 long years it had been an obsession, his wildest dream, to be sitting in this seat, waiting for the 0 count to come through the headphones. Years of hoping, of pulling strings, of talking to people and dropping chance remarks, of studying and working and practicing, and finally, the note in his box, the trip down to the General's field office that day. Inside the office, the General had sat down, regarding him for a long moment with those cool grey eyes of his. Then he said, "You're sure you want to do this, Scotty? Dead sure?" Scotty had nodded, hardly able to find his voice. "I'd give anything. You've got to let me go." The General nodded slowly. "You might have to give your life. Does it mean that much to you? Millions of dollars have gone into this ship, but there's no way to be sure of it. It's a fearful gamble." "I'll take any odds, General. The sheep and the chickens came back. I'll come back." The General looked out the window, his face carved with weary lines. "I hate to send a man alone, but what we need to know, 1 man can find out. 2 would be a waste, a tragic waste. The sheep and chickens didn't land, they just circled. But 1 man must go up to land a ship and take off again for the first time." His eyes caught Scotty's gravely. "I want you to know why it's got to be you alone. We can't gamble on 2 men's lives when 1 will do. You're the guinea pig." Scotty had stood up then, laughing. "Are you trying to frighten me? Look, General, I've been working on this ship since it first started. I know it inside out and backwards. I'm not afraid of this trip. I've got to be the one to go." The General had shifted some papers on his desk. "All right. They weighed you in at 142 pounds. Our calculations call for 135. Every ounce over that cuts a hard percentage out of your fuel. You'll have to suck down." "I can do that." "All right, but don't starve yourself, and don't dehydrate any more than you absolutely must. You'll have enough water for 10 days, no more. 3 up, 3 back, 4 there. Now then, the psych boys will go to work on your coordination for the next few days. That's critical. The first and second stages will disengage automatically, but you'll have to maneuver your own landing." Scotty nodded. "I've been maneuvering dummies until I'm blue in the face." "You'll need it pounded in." "It's pounded, don't worry." The General gave a satisfied nod. "All right, Scotty. See you at the blast-off. And remember, if you want to pull out, nobody will blame you. Right down to the last minute before 0 you can pull out." "I don't think so," said Scotty. "I don't think I'm going to pull out. Not on this one." 0 minus 20 minutes. The harsh metallic voice dragged Scotty back to the present with a jolt. For a moment he had almost regained the old familiar burn of self-assured bravado he had felt as he had finished talking to the general that day and sauntered out toward the ship standing in the launching scaffold. He had even been smiling as he recalled the interview. But now his eye caught the dull gleam of the control board before him, and his smile faded. The voice was whispering softly deep inside his head. "Come off it, Scotty. Who are you trying to kid?" His hand trembled and he leaned back, forcing his tense leg muscles to relax. "What do you mean, who am I trying to kid?" he thought angrily. "You're crazy. Would I be kidding myself? I quit kidding myself years ago. I know what I'm up to. This is a journey for heroes, and I'm going to be the hero this time. For sure. This time there won't be any doubt. They won't have any doubt, and I won't have any doubt. You're alone, Scotty. Remember? You can quit acting now." He shuddered and glanced uneasily around the tiny closed chamber. "Alone? What a laugh. A man can never be alone. There are always a million memories wheeling and spinning and roaring around inside your head. Memories of people, of hopes and dreams and fears. You can build a heavy wall in your mind to keep them back, but when you're alone and scared and helpless, the wall starts to crumble down. There's nobody to fool anymore, Scotty. The act is over. Admit it, you're scared. You can hardly hold still, you're so scared. He clapped his hands to his ears, trying to shut out the whisper. He kept shaking his head, but it came through like a heavy surf. He sat tense, trembling, with salty droplets pouring down his face, shaking his head helplessly. "You're caught now," the voice whispered. "This is a one-way ride and you know it, and you're scared." "I'm not!" The earphones clicked. "You say something, Scotty?" Scotty took a deep breath, unclenching his hands. No, nothing. What's the zero count, Mitch?" 0 minus 16 minutes. Everything set?" "All set. I wish we could get going." Scotty twisted on the couch, feeling the silence close down around him like a stifling blanket. He was almost shouting to himself. "All right, I'm scared. Wouldn't anybody be scared? Sitting here, waiting, thinking about 200,000 miles of nothing with a rocky world of death at the other end to land on? Why shouldn't I be scared? They can stay back here and track me with their scopes and radar. It's fine for them. It's fine for the Secretary of Defense, too. No skin off his back if something happens. And the big boys in Hollywood can sit back at their desks and rub their fat hands together and hope their cameras work all right, hope the pictures come out good so they can make their pile if I get back. Big gamble for them. First moon pictures released. See man's greatest adventure in glorious Technicolor. Authentic films from the first moon rocket. Prices only slightly advanced. Big gamble. Those films will help pay for a lot of fuel, a lot of metal and man-hours spent on this ship. But can it pay for a life? Bitterness swept through Scotty's mind sharply. It was his life they were bartering. He was to be the star of those films, dead or alive. He could be killed in the blast-off and the films would keep rolling, keep churning out the yardage, and 30 years later they could pick up the film and still make their nice safe pile. 30 years of cold death for him. "But why are you whining now, little man? Why all the tears all of a sudden? You asked for it. You made your bed right from scratch. You wanted to be the hero. Nothing else would do. Well, here you are, hero. Tough. You asked for it. But why?" And then something was tugging at his mind, seeping through the heavy wall of memory. A terrible, loathsome thought. He shook his head, desperately trying to fight it back, but the wall began to crumble. Long, dead pictures began drifting through, long hidden memories. A bare whisper of thought, cold, relentless, devastating. "Admit it, Scotty. You had to come. You had to be sitting in this seat. You couldn't do anything else, could you? You couldn't let them know about you. You couldn't bear to let the boys down on the field suspect the truth, could you, Scotty? You looked into their eyes and you were afraid they suspected, like Matty had suspected, like Dad had suspected so many years ago. You had to come here. You couldn't help yourself, could you?" The whisper broke into a coarse, derisive laugh, and Scotty cowered back, shaking his head in denial, his whole body trembling. "Take a look, Scotty. Take a good look. Are you trying to hide the truth from yourself? But you can't get away with that. You can't hide it from yourself any longer." And then the wall of memory buckled and split wide open. "You can fool the whole world, Scotty, but you can't fool yourself," the voice screamed in his ear. "You can run and hide and twist and lie, but you can't ever really fool yourself. You know it's true. You always have known. You're a coward, Scotty. A dirty yellow coward. You always have been, and you always will be." 0 minus 10 minutes. It wasn't true. He shook his head helplessly as his fingers found the safety belts, tightened them down fiercely on his chest and legs. Wasn't he sitting here now, waiting for the last count, waiting to start on the greatest adventure man had ever attempted? Would he be here if he were a coward? He snarled and clenched his fists tight on the armrests. It was a lie. It couldn't be true. No man can stare himself in the face and call himself a coward when there is a spark of life left in him at all. He can call himself a cheat or a liar or a fake. Those were things that could be changed, things that could be made up for. But a coward had something wrong deep inside, something that was built in, that could never be changed as long as a man lived. No man could call himself that. Scotty shook his head, half laughing, half crying. He was scared, sure. Anybody would be scared. But he wasn't a coward. He was in this ship because he wanted fame, because he craved excitement and adventure. Nothing had made him volunteer. He'd done it because he was that kind of guy. But he knew that was a lie. Its very falsehood writhed in his brain as he thought it. You're here because your cheap, cowardly little soul couldn't bear to face itself. You're here because you couldn't bear the looks of the men around you with their barbed wisecracks and their guarded half-smiles. They thought you couldn't see them, but the whispers were there, and you couldn't stand for them to guess. But what did he care what they thought? What were they to him? He knew he was better than they were, quicker, smarter, braver. He didn't have to prove anything to them. And Matty? Does Matty know how brave you are, hero? Can you prove to Matty that you're not a coward? Matty knows about you, remember? Scotty shook his head fearfully. That was so long ago. But things like that are never long ago, Scotty. They stay with you as long as you live. Sure, the army said you were a hero. They gave you a silver star. But what would Matty say if he could ever say anything again? Would he say you were a hero? Suddenly, Matty's torn and twisted face seemed to be peering out at him from the control panel. His mind went whirling back through the years, completely out of control. In an instant, he had slipped back 15 long years, back to the hot, stinking, sweaty deadliness of that little jungle island. They had been deep in the jungle that night, holed in, scared to move, afraid even to breathe. For a week they had been waiting for the snipers to move in and spot them. He could remember the cold, desperate fear that had gnawed at him that night as he and Bill Matthews had clutched their rifles, waiting, creeping forward along the jungle trail through the blackness and the night sounds. His clothes had stuck to his body with sweat as they crept, the sweat of mortal fear. The mosquitoes whined in clouds around his head, his body stung with 1,000 insect bites. Up ahead, somewhere in the sticky blackness, was a machine gun, blocking them from their supplies, blocking them from the plasma and penicillin powder the patrol needed more than any food or water. They had been waiting for many days, and they were weak with hunger and thirst. But there was a gun, and sharp, cruel eyes watching. They had been moving in pairs, and Scotty had felt the fear clutching his chest, fear beyond any words. He and Matty were working their way down a swampy river bottom, sliding on their bellies in the muck when they had spotted the nest. and then the fear and panic building up inside him had broken through. He had jumped up, screaming, and burst forward, gun chattering in his hand. Blind rage and fear drove him forward as the startled gunners swiveled their gun, piercing the night with their sharp cries. Matty had shouted at him to get down, but he ran forward in the darkness wildly. A burst of fire screamed out at him through the jungle. He slid into the mud, panting, still firing into the face of the blazing machine gun until he saw the last man twist and fall and the gun fell silent. A hero, they said. But later he had found Matty lying twisted with his head split open, a line of open holes cutting down through his neck and across his shoulders. Another few seconds, another instant of control would have given them time to get the machine gun in crossfire. But something had exploded in Scotty's brain that night, a fear greater than any fear of being shot, a fear of being exposed for what he was, what he knew he was. He had dragged Matty back through the long miles of sniper-ridden jungle, and they called him a hero, and he had never told them who had broken first and drawn the deadly fire. His forehead stood out with sweat now, and he tried to hide his eyes. He had spent many years forgetting that horrible night, trying to cleanse himself of the depths of guilt that had eaten away at him, and now it was back, harsh and undeniable, intensified by years of self-deceit and self-justification and rationalization. But the chips were down now. In a few moments a great fire would explode deep in the bowels of this ship, and he would be driven forward, far out into space along trails never blazed by man. 0-5 minutes. Give her a final check, Scotty. He jerked in his seat as though he had been struck. 5 minutes! His mind whirled with memories, and the cold fear cut through him like a knife. In a moment of panic, his mind was screaming, "Get out, now, before it's too late! The General said you could pull out, right down to the last minute. Well, pull out now, before the engines start." But a peal of derisive laughter roared through his mind. There had been reporters, news stories. He had said things that had been splashed across 1 million newspapers. Back out now? Tell the world what a coward he was? Then everybody would know. The boys down below, Matty, Dad. Dad had never actually said it, but it had always been there as long as Scotty could remember. He had tried and tried to make up for his small size, for his skinny legs and bony chest. It hadn't been his fault that Dad was such a big man, such a rugged, powerful man. Those long hunting trips up through Canada. A man had to share the load. There was no place for weakness and weariness there. And Dad had taken him along once until he had tired and turned his ankle on a short portage. They had carried him out, and he knew that he had lost his dad that day. Dad hadn't admitted it, but it was true. There was always the half-hidden disgust and sadness and disappointment in his cool grey eyes. -2, Scotty. Final check. His hand flicked out automatically as fear and dismay welled up in his mind. Everything he had ever done, he had flubbed somehow. He searched frantically through his mind for one small, pure act of absolute bravery, unadorned by words, unaltered by empty rationalizations and built-up courage, and his mind yielded nothing but hoarse, heavy laughter. Somewhere there was a key. It had started somewhere, if only he could remember. Somewhere beneath the years of futile failure there was a core. 60 seconds, Scotty. Good luck, boy. He froze, his hands clutching the safety belt in a grip of iron as the words pounded in his ear. 40, 35, 30, 25. And then, like a great door opening up in his mind, he remembered. A day so long ago, so deeply buried that it had not come to mind in years. A day when he had been walking down a village street on the way to the store for his mother, a small boy, hardly 10. A group of boys appearing suddenly from the old garage he was passing. A thin-faced lad, tall and sharp-boned, with cold eyes and a sneer on his thin lips. Other boys, too, mostly bigger than he. His eyes widened and he started to back away when Thin-Face grabbed his collar, pulled him up sharp. Where you think you're going, bud? Just down the street. Who said you could walk on this street? It's not your street. I can walk where I want. A gleam of cruelty in Thin-Face's eyes. Sissy thinks he's smart. A sharp-knuckled hand struck him across the nose. You want to fight? Scotty shook his head, eyes wide. No, I just want to... His eye caught one of the others sidling around behind him. Stand still! He had been paralyzed. The rabbit punch struck him a hammer blow and tears streamed down his face. Thin-Face hit him again and blood spurted from his nose. Put up your hands and fight. I can't. You better fight, sissy. I'll kill ya. I don't want to fight. The fear, the mortification, the blind, paralyzing fear. Another blow struck him, and he tumbled backwards over the boy who had crouched behind him and struck his head on the sidewalk. They had roared with laughter, and one of them kicked him. And then he was on his feet, darting between them, running for his life, running with blind fear snarling at his heels, down an alley, into a backyard, across into another alley. He had seen the open cellarway then, and crawled down in, heart pounding in his throat, waiting as the boys came through the yard, looking, laughing at the sport, walking on. He waited for hours before he dared come out, and every minute of those hours he trembled, desperately sick and ashamed, wondering what Dad would ever think of him if he should find out. Something struck him in the chest then, a firm, gentle pressure that grew and grew as the cabin vibrated with a powerful roar. The pressure grew larger, choking the breath from him. In a last terrible panic of fear, Scotty tried to fight his safety belt open, tried to cry out to stop, stop, stop. But it was too late. He pressed back deeper and deeper into the couch as the age-long seconds ticked by, and in the viewer the earth fell away, farther and farther, dwindling, dimming. He heard the explosion as the first stage disengaged, and his mind froze as the pressure shoved harder at his chest. Then, suddenly, there was a jerk, a bone-crushing jar that nearly broke his neck, and the ship started spinning crazily. Scotty! Scotty, can you hear me? It was Mitch's voice in the earphones, heavy with frantic urgency. Can you hear me, Scotty? Scotty groaned. I can hear you, he croaked. Scotty, the second stage didn't disengage properly. You've got it on your tail yet? Scotty gasped for breath, trying to focus his mind on the present, trying to drive out the paralyzing phantoms of the past. Second stage? Wait a minute. You're way off course. There it goes. You've lost it. There was a scraping sound in the earphones, and then the General's voice snapped out, sharp and clear. Scotty, listen, boy. You're off course. You aren't out far enough. You'll have to orbit back. Orbit? The word was wrenched from his throat, and he stared at the viewer in horror. Listen, Scotty, get this straight. Can you hear me, lad? Yeah, I can hear. Then listen. Orbit your ship. Slam down the cutoff and... I can correct, Scotty cried. I can get back on beam and make it. Scotty, you'd used too much fuel. You didn't get out far enough. You dragged dead weight. I can correct. You'll never be able to land up there. If you do, you'll never be able to take off again. I've got to get out there. The General's voice was frantic. This is an order, man. Orbit your ship. We'll find some way to get you down, but you'll have to come back. Something exploded in Scotty's mind then. Rage bubbled over in his mind, and he was screaming in the speaker. I'm going on out. I'm going to land up there. I can't flub it now. I can't. Scotty, orbit while you can. There'll be another try. I can't hear you. I said, I'm going out. Get somebody up there to get me if you want to, but I'm going. He ripped off the earphones, the bitterness and rage and frustration of long years welling into his mind. He was seething, almost crying out in his rage. Everything he had ever done he had flubbed, but he wouldn't flub this one. Fiercely he went to work on the controls, tears rolling down his cheeks as he worked. He was going to go on, if it killed him. He felt the ship respond to its new course, slightly, and then gradually the weight began to lift from his chest. He sank back, panting. Up in the screen was a pale yellow ball, and he was racing toward it as fast as a man could race. There would be plenty of time for the sensitive calculations for careful course plotting later. But he was not going back. They might get a ship up to get him in time, and again they might not. He had food and water for 10 days at full rations. He could live for 30 days on it, maybe more. And when the rations were gone, how long could he live then? How long did we live in the jungle without food or water? He sat back then and laughed. It would be better to die up there than to spend the rest of his life dying down on Earth. Dying every day, 1,000 deaths. They might be able to rescue him with fast work with a fearful margin of incredible luck. But it didn't really matter to him now whether they did or didn't. He knew that now. He had already died, back there on the ground, waiting for the zero count to come. He was reborn now, a new man with a great courageous job to do. This time he would do the job right. Fear was behind him now, for he could never be afraid again like he had been afraid a few short minutes before. The gauntlet was run. He would land on the moon, and no man nor memory would stop him from doing it. No fear, no cowardice. Because a coward would have turned back. He settled back in the couch and drifted into sleep with a peaceful smile on his lips. Games by Katherine MacLean. Narrated by William Skye. It is a tough assignment for a child to know where a daydream ends and impossibility begins. Ronnie was playing by himself, which meant he was 2 tribes of Indians having a war. Bang, he muttered, firing an imaginary rifle. He decided that it was a time in history before the white people had sold the Indians any guns, and changed the rifle into a bow. Whiz thunk, he substituted, mimicking from an Indian film on TV the graphic sound of an arrow striking flesh. Oof! He folded down onto the grass, moaning, "Oh!" and relaxing into defeat and death. "Want some chocolate milk, Ronnie?" asked his mother's voice from the kitchen. "No thanks," he called back, climbing to his feet to be another man. Whiz thunk, he added to the flights of arrows as the best archer in the tribe. "Last arrow. Whiz," he said, missing one enemy for realism. He addressed another battling brave. "Who has more arrows? They are coming too close. No time. I'll have to use my knife." He drew the imaginary knife, ducking an arrow as it shot close. Then he was the tribal chief, standing somewhere else, and he saw that the warriors left alive were outnumbered. "We must retreat. We cannot leave our tribe without warriors to protect the women." Ronnie decided that the chief was heroically wounded, his voice wavering from weakness. He had been propping himself against a tree to appear unharmed, but now he moved so that his braves could see he was pinned to the trunk by an arrow and could not walk. They cried out. He said, "Leave me and escape. But remember." No words came, just the feeling of being what he was, a dying old eagle, a chief of warriors, speaking to young warriors who would need advice of seasoned humor and moderation to carry them through their young battles. He had to finish the sentence, tell them something wise. Ronnie tried harder, pulling the feeling around him like a cloak of resignation and pride, leaning indifferently against the tree where the arrow had pinned him, hearing dimly in anticipation the sound of his aged voice conquering weakness to speak wisely of what they needed to be told. They had many battles ahead of them, and the battles would be against odds, with so many dead already. They must watch and wait, be flexible and tenacious, determined and persistent, but not too rash, subtle and indirect, not cowardly, and above all be patient with the triumph of the enemy and not maddened into suicidal direct attack. His stomach hurt with the arrow wound, and his braves waited to hear his words. He had to sum a part of his life's experience in words. Ronnie tried harder to build the scene realistically. Then suddenly it was real. He was the man. He was an old man, guide and advisor in an oblique battle against great odds. He was dying of something, and his stomach hurt with a knotted ache like hunger, and he was thirsty. He had refused to let the young men make the sacrifice of trying to rescue him. He was hostage in the jail and dying because he would not surrender to the enemy nor cease to fight them. He smiled and said, "Remember to live like other men, but remember to remember." And then he was saying things that could not be put into words, complex feelings that were ways of taking bad situations that made them easier to smile at, and then sentences that were not sentences, but single alphabet letters pushing each other with signs, with a feeling of being connected like two halves of a swing, one side moving up when the other moved down, or like swings or like cogs and pendulums inside a clock, only without the cogs, just with the push. It wasn't adding or multiplication, and it used letters instead of numbers, but Ronnie knew it was some kind of arithmetic. And he wasn't Ronnie. He was an old man teaching young men, and the old man did not know about Ronnie. He thought sadly how little he would be able to convey to the young men, and he remembered more, trying to sum long memories and much living into a few direct thoughts. And Ronnie was the old man and himself, both at once. It was too intense. Part of Ronnie wanted to escape and be alone, and that part withdrew and wanted to play something. Ronnie sat in the grass and played with his toes, much like a younger child. Part of Ronnie that was Dr. Revert Purcell sat on the edge of a prison cot, concentrating on secret unpublished equations of biogenic stability, which he wanted to pass on to the responsible hands of young researchers in the concealed research chain. He was using the way of thinking which they had told him was the telepathic sending of ideas to anyone ready to receive. It was odd that he himself could never tell when he was sending. Probably a matter of age. They had started trying to teach him when he was already too old for anything so different. The water tap, 4 feet away, was dripping steadily, and it was hard for Purcell to concentrate, so intense was his thirst. He wondered if he could gather strength to walk that far. He was sitting up, and that was good, but the struggle to raise himself that far had left him dizzy and trembling. If he tried to stand, the effort would surely interrupt his transmitting of equations and all the data he had not sent yet. Would the man with the keys who looked in the door twice a day care whether Purcell died with dignity? He was the only audience, and his expression never changed when Purcell asked him to point out to the authorities that he was not being given anything to eat. It was funny to Purcell to find out that he wanted the respect of any audience to his dying, even of a man without response who treated him as if he were already a corpse. Perhaps the man would respond if Purcell said, "I have changed my mind, I will tell." But if he said that, he would lose his own respect. At the biochemists and biophysicists convention, the reporter had asked him if any of his researches could be applied to warfare. He had answered with no feeling of danger, knowing that what he did was common practice among research men, sure that it was an unchallengeable right. "Some of them can, but those I keep to myself." The reporter remained deadpan. "For instance?" "Well, I have to choose something that won't reveal how it's done now, but, for example, a way of cheaply mass-producing specific antitoxins against any germ. It sounds harmless if you don't think about it, but actually it would make germ warfare the most deadly and inexpensive weapon yet developed, for it would make it possible to prevent the backspread of contagion into a country's own troops without much expense. There would be hell to pay if anyone ever let that out." Then he had added, trying to get the reporter to understand enough to change his cynical, unimpressed expression, "You understand, germs are cheap. There would be a new plague to spread every time some pipsqueak biologist mutated a new germ. It isn't even expensive or difficult, as atom bombs are." The headline was, "Scientist Refuses to Give Secret of Weapon to Government." Government men came and asked him if this was correct, and on having it confirmed, pointed out that he had an obligation. The research foundations where he had worked were subsidized by government money. He had been deferred from military service during his early years of study and work, so he could become a scientist instead of having to fight or die on the battlefield. "This might be so," he had said. "I am making an attempt to serve mankind by doing as much good and as little damage as possible. If you don't mind, I'd rather use my own judgment about what constitutes service." The statement seemed too blunt the minute he had said it, and he recognized that it had implications that his judgment was superior to that of the government. It probably was the most antagonizing thing that could have been said, but he could see no other possible statement, for it represented precisely what he thought. There were bigger headlines about that interview, and when he stepped outside his building for lunch the next day, several small gangs of patriots arrived with the proclaimed purpose of persuading him to tell. They fought each other for the privilege. The police had rescued him after he had lost several front teeth and had one eye badly gouged. They then left him to the care of the prison doctor in protective custody. 2 days later, after having been questioned several times on his attitude toward revealing the parts of his research he had kept secret, he was transferred to a place that looked like a military jail and left alone. He was not told what his status was. When someone came and asked him questions about his attitude, Purcell felt quite sure that what they were doing to him was illegal. He stated that he was going on a hunger strike until he was allowed to have visitors and see a lawyer. The next time the dinner hour arrived, they gave him nothing to eat. There had been no food in the cell since, and that was probably 2 weeks ago. He was not sure just how long, for during part of the second week his memory had become garbled. He dimly remembered something that might have been delirium, which could have lasted more than 1 day. Perhaps the military who wanted the antitoxins for germ warfare were waiting quietly for him either to talk or die. Ronnie got up from the grass and went into the kitchen, stumbling in his walk like a beginning toddler. "Choc milk?" he said to his mother. She poured him some and teased gently. "What's the matter, Ronnie? Back to baby talk?" He looked at her with big solemn eyes and drank slowly, not answering. In the cell somewhere distant, Dr. Purcell, famous biochemist, began waveringly trying to rise to his feet, unable to remember hunger as anything separate from him that could ever be ended, but weakly wanting a glass of water. Ronnie could not feed him with the chocolate milk. Even though this was another himself, the body that was drinking was not the one that was thirsty. He wandered out into the backyard again, carrying the glass. "Bang!" he said deceptively, pointing with his hand in case his mother was looking. "Bang!" Everything had to seem usual, he was sure of that. This was too big a thing and too private to tell a grown-up. On the way back from the sink, Dr. Purcell slipped and fell and hit his head against the edge of the iron cot. Ronnie felt the edge gashing through skin and into bone and then a relaxing blankness inside his head, like falling asleep suddenly when they are telling you a fairy story while you want to stay awake to find out what happened next. "Bang!" said Ronnie, vaguely pointing at a tree. "Bang!" He was ashamed because he had fallen down in the cell and hurt his head and become just Ronnie again before he had finished sending out his equations. He tried to make believe he was alive again, but it didn't work. You could never make believe anything to a real good finish. They never ended neatly. There was always something unfinished and something that would go right on after the end. It would have been nice if the jailers had come in and he had been able to say something noble to them before dying to show that he was brave. "Bang," he said randomly, pointing his finger at his head, and then jerked his hand away as if it had burned him. He had become the wrong person that time. The feel of a bullet jolting the side of his head was startling and unpleasant, even if not real, and the flash of someone's vindictive anger and self-pity while pulling a trigger. My wife will be sorry she ever... He didn't like that kind of make-believe. It felt unsafe to do it without making up a story first. Ronnie decided to be Indian braves again. They weren't very real, and when they were, they had simple, straightforward emotions about courage and skill and pride and friendship that he would like. A man was leaning his arms on the fence, watching him. "Nice day." "What's the matter, kid? Are you an esper?" "Hello." Ronnie stood on one foot and watched him. "Just making believe. I only want to play. They make it too serious having all these troubles." "Good countryside." The man gestured at the backyards, all opened in together with tangled bushes here and there to crouch behind when other kids were there to play hide and seek, and with trees to climb. It can be the universe if you pick and choose who to be, and don't let wrong choices make you shut off from it. You can make yourself learn from this if you are strong enough. Who have you been? Ronnie stood on the other foot and scratched the back of his leg with his toes. He didn't want to remember. He always forgot right away, but this grown-up was confident and young and strong-looking and meant something when he talked, not like most grown-ups. "I was playing Indian. I was an old chief captured by enemies trying to pass on to other warriors the wisdom of my life before I died." He made believe he was the chief a little to show the young man what he was talking about. "Purcell!" The man drew in his breath between his teeth and his face paled. He pulled back from reaching Ronnie with his feelings, like holding his breath in. "Good game." "You can learn from him. Don't leave him shut off, I beg you. You can let him influence you without being pulled off your own course. He was a good man. You were honored, and I envy the man you will be if you contacted him on resonant similarities." The grown-up looked frightened. "But you are too young. You'll block him out and lose him. Kids have to grow and learn at their own speed." Then he looked less afraid, but uncertain, and his thoughts struggled against each other. Their own speed. But there should be someone alive with Purcell's pattern and memories. We loved him. Kids should grow at their own speed, but... How strong are you, Ronnie? Can you move ahead of the normal growth pattern? Grown-ups always want you to do something. Ronnie stared back, clenching his hands and moving his feet uneasily. The thoughts were open to him. Do you want to be the old chief again, Ronnie? Be him often, so you can learn to know what he knew? And feel as he felt. It would be a stiff dose for a kid. It will be rich and exciting, full of memories and skills. But hard to chew. I'm doing this for Purcell, Ronnie, not for you. You have to make up your own mind. That was a good game. Are you going to play it any more? His mother would not like it. She would feel the difference in him as much as if he had read one of the books she kept away from him, books that were supposed to be for adults only. The difference would hurt her. He was being bad, like eating between meals. But to know what grown-ups knew... He tightened his fists and looked down at the grass. I'll play it some more. The young man smiled, still pale and holding half his feelings back behind a dam. Then mesh with me a moment. Let me in. He was in with the thought, feeling Ronnie's confused consent, reassuring him by not thinking or looking around inside while sending out a single call. Purcell! Doc! That found the combination key to Ronnie's guarded yesterdays and last nights and 10 minutes ago's. Ronnie, I'll set that door, Purcell's memories, open for you. You can't close it, but feel like this about it. And he planted in a strong set. Questioning, cool, open, a feeling of absorbing without words. It will give you information when you need it, like a dictionary. The grown-up straightened away from the fence, preparing to walk off. Behind a dam pressed grief and anger for the death of the man he called Purcell. And any time you want to be the old chief at any age he lived, just make believe you are him. Grief and anger pressed more strongly against the dam, and the man turned and left rapidly, letting his thoughts flicker and scatter through private memories that Ronnie did not share, that no one shared, breaking thought contact with everyone so that the man could be alone in his own mind to have his feelings in private. Ronnie picked up the empty glass that had held his chocolate milk from the back steps where he had left it and went inside. As he stepped into the kitchen, he knew what another kitchen had looked like for a 5-year-old child who had been Purcell 90 years ago. There had been an iron sink and a brown and green spotted faucet, and the glass had been heavier and transparent, like real glass. Ronnie reached up and put the coloured plastic tumbler down. "That was a nice young man, dear. What did he say to you?" Ronnie looked up at his mama, comparing her with the remembered mama of 50 years ago. He loved the other one too. "He told me he's glad I play Indian." If you're enjoying the stories, hit the like button to support the channel. Thanks. The Spicy Sound of Success by Jim Harmon. Narrated by William Skye. Now was the captain's chance to prove he knew less than the crew. All their lives hung upon it. There was nothing showing on the video screen. That was why we were looking at it so analytically. "Transphasia, that's what it is," Ordinary Spaceman Quaid stated with a definite thrust of his angular jaw in my direction. "You can take my word on that, Captain Gavin." "Can't," I told him. "I can't trust your opinion. I can't trust anything. That's why I'm captain." "You'll get over feeling like that." "I know. Then I'll become first officer." "But look at that screen, sir," Quaid said with an emphatic swing of his scarred arm. "I've seen blank scanning like that before, and you haven't. It's your first trip. This always means transphasia, cortex dissolution, motor area feedback, the atrial effect. Call it anything you like, it's still transphasia." "I know what transphasia is," I said moderately. "It means an electrogravitational disturbance of incoming sense data, rechanneling it to the wrong receptive areas. Besides the human brain, it also affects electronic equipment like radar and television." "Obviously." Quaid glanced disgustedly at the screen. "Too obvious. This time it might not be a familiar condition of many planetary gravitational fields. On this planet, that blink kinescope may mean our big brother kites were knocked down by hostile natives." "You are plain wrong, Captain. Traditionally, alien races never interfere with our explorations. Generally, they are so alien to us they can't even recognize our existence." I drew myself up to my full height and noticed in irritation it was still an inch less than Quaid's. "I don't understand you men. Look at yourself, Quaid. You've been busted to ordinary spacemen for just that kind of thinking, for relying on tradition, on things that have worked before. Not only your thinking is slipshod, you've grown careless about everything else, even your own life." "Just a minute, Captain. I've never been busted. In the exploration service, we regard ordinary spacemen as our highest rank. With my hazard pay, I get more hard cash than you do, and I'm closer to retirement." "That's a shallow excuse for complacency." "Complacency? I've seen 10,000 wonders in 20 years of space, with a million variations. But the patterns repeat themselves. We learn to know what to expect, so maybe we can't maintain the reactionary caution the service likes in officers." "I resent the word reactionary, spaceman. In civilian life I was a lapidary and I learned the value of deliberation. But I never got too cataleptic to tap $1 million gem, which is more than my contemporaries can say, many of them." "Captain Gavin," Quaid said patiently, "you must realize that an outsider like you among a crew of skilled spacemen can never be more than a figurehead." Was this the way I was to be treated? Why, this man had deliberately insulted me, his captain. I controlled myself, remembering the familiarity that had always existed between members of a crew working under close conditions from the time of the ancient submarines and the first orbital ships. "Quaid," I said, "there's only one way for us to find out which of us is right about the cause of our scanning blackout. We go out and find the reason." "Exactly. We go. You and me. I hope you can stand my company." "I'm not sure I can," he answered reluctantly. "My hazard pay doesn't cover exploring with rookies. With all due respect, Captain." I clapped him on the shoulder. "But man, you have just been telling me all we had to worry about was common transphasia. A man with your experience could protect himself and cover even a rookie under such familiar conditions, right? Yes, sir, I suppose I could, Quaid said, bitterly aware he had lost out somewhere and hoping that it wasn't the start of a trend. Looks okay to me, I said. Quaid passed a gauntlet over his faceplate. It's real. I can blur it with a smudged visor. When it blurs, it's solid. The landscape beyond the black corona left by our landing rockets was unimpressive. The rocky desert was made up of silicon and iron oxide, so it looked much the same as a terrestrial location. Yellowish-white sand ran up to and around reddish-brown rock clawing into the pink sunlight. I don't understand it, Quaid admitted. Transphasia hits you afoul as soon as you let it into the airlock. Apparently, Quaid, this thing is going to creep up on us. Don't sound smug, Captain. It's pity-pattying behind you, too. The keening call across the surface of consciousness postponed my reply. The wail was ominously forlorn, defiant of description. I turned my head around slowly inside my helmet, not even sure that I had heard it. But what else can you do with a wail but hear it? Quaid nodded. I've felt this before. It usually hits sooner. Let's trace it. I don't like this, I admitted. It's not at all what I expected from what you said about transphasia. It must be something else. It couldn't be anything else. I know what to expect. You don't. You may begin smelling sensations, tasting sounds, hearing sights, seeing tastes, touching odors, or any other combination. Don't let it bother you. Of course not. I'll soothe my nerves by counting little shocks of lanolin jumping over a loud fence. Quaid grinned behind his faceplate. Good idea. Then you can have it. I'm going to try keeping my eyes open and staying alive. There was no reply. His expression was tart and greasy despite all his light talk, and I knew mine was the same. I tested the security rope between our pressure suits. It was a taut and virile base. We scaled a staccato of rocks, our suits grinding pepper against our hides. The Musk summit rose before us, a minor key horizon, with a shifting treble for as far as I could smell. It was primitive beauty that made you feel shocking pink inside. The most beautiful vista I had ever tasted, it couldn't be dulled even by the sensation of beef broth under my skin. Is this transphasia? I asked in awe. It always has been before, Quaid remarked. Ready to swallow your words about this being something an old hand wouldn't recognize, Captain? I'm swallowing no words until I find out precisely how they taste here. Not a bad taste. They're pretty. Or haven't you noticed? Quaid, you're right. About the colours, anyway. This reminds me of an oscilloscope recording from a cybernetic translator. It should. I don't suppose we could understand each other if it wasn't for our Morphis study courses in reading cross-sense translations of Centauri blush talk and the like. It became difficult to understand him, difficult to try talking in the face of such splendour. You never really appreciate colours until you smell them for the first time. Quaid was as conversational as ever, though. I can't see irregularities occurring in a gravitational field. We must have compensated for the transphasia while we still had a point of reference, the solid reality of the spaceship. But out here, where all we have to hang on to is each other, our concept of reality goes bang and deflates to a tired joke. Before I could agree with one of his theories for once, a streak of spice shot past us. It bounced back tangibly and made a bitter rip between the two of us. There was no time to judge its size, if it had size, or its decibel range, or its caloric count, before a small, sharp pain dug in and dwindled down to nothing in one long second. The new odour pattern in my head told me Quaid was saying something I couldn't quite make out. Quaid then pulled me in the direction of the nasty little pain. "Wait a minute, spaceman," I bellowed. "Where the devil do you think you're dragging me? Halt! That's a direct order." He stopped. Don't you want to find out what that was? This is an exploration party, you know, sir. I'm not sure I do want to find out what that was just now. I didn't like the feel of it. But the important thing is for us not to get any further from the ship. That's important, Captain? To the best of my judgment, yes. This condition didn't begin until we got so far away from the spacer in time or distance. I don't want it to get any worse. It's troublesome not to know black from white, but it would be a downright inconvenience not to know which way is up. Not for an experienced spaceman, Quaid griped. I'm used to free fall. But he turned back. Just a minute, I said. There was something strange up ahead. I want to see if short-range radar can get through our electrogravitational jamming here. I took a sighting. My helmet set projected the pattern on the cornea. Sweetness building up to a stab of pure salt. Those were the blips. Beside me there was a thin thread of violet. Quaid had whistled. He was reading the map too. The slope fell away sharply in front of us, becoming a deep gorge. There was something broken and twisted at the bottom, something we had known for an instant as a streak of spice. There's one free fall, I said, where you wouldn't live long enough to get used to it. He said nothing on the route back to the spacer. I know all about this sort of thing, Gav, First Officer Nagurski said expansively. He was rubbing the well-worn ears of our beagle mascot, Bruce. A heavy tail thudded on the steel deck from time to time. My finger could barely get in the chafing band of my regulation collar. I was hot and tired, fresh, in only the chronological sense, from a pressure suit. What do you know all about, Nagurski? Dogs, spacemen, women, transphasia? Yes, he answered casually. But I had immediate reference to our current psychophysiological phenomenon. I collapsed into the swivel in front of the chart table. First off, let's hear what you know about... Never mind, make it dogs. Take Bruce, for example, then. No thanks, I was wondering why you did. I didn't. His dark, round face was bland. Bruce picked me, followed me home one night in Chicago port. The dog or the man who picks his own master is the most content. Bruce is content, I admitted. He couldn't be any more content and still be alive. But I'm not sure that theory works out with men. We'd have anarchy if I tried to let these Starbucks pick their own master. I had no trouble when I was a captain, Nagurski said. Ease the reins on the men. Just offer them your advice, your guidance. They will soon see why the service selected you as captain. They will pick you themselves. Did your crew voluntarily elect you as their leader? Of course they did, Gav. I'm an old hand at controlling crews. Then why are you first officer under me now? He blinked, then decided to laugh. I've been in space a good many years. I really wanted to relax a little bit more. Besides, the increase in hazard pay was actually more than my salary as a captain. I'm a notch nearer retirement, too. Tell me, did you always feel this way about letting the men select their own leader? Nagurski brought out a pipe. He would have a pipe, I decided. No, not always. I was like you at first. Fresh from the cosmic energy test lab, suspicious of everything, trying to tell the old hands what to do. But I learned that they are pretty smart boys. They know what they are doing. You can rely on them absolutely. I leaned forward, elbows on knees. Let me tell you a thing, Nagurski. Your trust of these damn fool spacemen is why you are no longer a captain. You can't trust anything out here in space, much less human nature. Even I know that much. He was pained. If you don't trust the men, they won't trust you, Gav. They don't have to trust me. All they have to do is obey me, or, by Jupiter, get frozen stiff and thawed out just in time for court-martial back home. Listen, I continued earnestly, these men aren't going to think of me, of us, the officers, as their leaders. As far as the crew is concerned, ordinary spaceman Quaid is the best man on this ship. He is a good man, Nagurski said. You mustn't be jealous of his status." The dog growled. He must have sensed what I almost did to Nagurski. "Never mind that for now," I said wearily. "What was your idea for getting our exploration parties through this transphasia?" "There's only one idea for that," said Quaid, ducking his long head and stepping through the connecting hatch. "With the captain's permission." "Go ahead, Quaid, tell him," Nagurski invited. "There's only one way to wade through transphasia with any reliability," Quaid told me. "You keep some kind of physical contact with the spaceship. Parties are strung out on guideline, like we were, but the cable has to be run back and made fast to the hull." "How far can we run it back?" Quaid shrugged. "Miles." "How many?" "We have 3 miles of cable. As long as you can feel, taste, see, smell, or hear that rope anchoring you to home, you aren't lost." 3 miles isn't good enough. We don't have enough fuel to change sites that often. You can't use the drive in a gravitational field, you know." "What else can we do, Captain?" Nagurski asked puzzledly. "You've said that the spaceship is our only protection from transphasia. Is that it?" Quaid gave a curt nod. "Then," I told them, "we will have to start tearing apart this ship." Sergeant Major Hoffman and his team were doing a good job of ripping out the side of the afterhold. Through the portal I could see the suited men expertly guiding the huge curved sections on their ray projectors. "Cannibalizing is dangerous," Nagurski put his pipe in his teeth and shook his head disapprovingly. "Spaceships have parts as interchangeable as erector sets. We can take apart the tractors and put our ship back together again after we complete the survey." "You can't assemble a jigsaw puzzle if some of the pieces are missing." "You can't get a complete picture, but you can get a good idea of what it looks like. We can take off in a reasonable facsimile of a spaceship." "Not," he persisted, "if too many parts are missing." "Nagurski, if you are looking for a job safer than space exploration, why don't you go back to testing cosmic bomb shelters?" Nagurski flushed. "Look here, Captain, you are being too damned cautious. There is a way one handles the survey of a planet like this, and this isn't the way." "It's my way. You heard what Quaid said. You know it yourself. The men have to have something tangible to hang on to out there. One slender cable isn't enough of an edge on sensory anarchy. If the product of their own technological civilization can keep them sane, I say let them take a part of that environment with them. In departing from standard procedure that we have learned to trust, you are risking more than a few men. You risk the whole mission in gambling so much of the ship. A captain doesn't take chances like that." "I never said I wouldn't take chances. But I'm not going to take stupid chances. I might be doing the wrong thing, but I can see you would be doing it wrong. You know nothing about space, Captain. You have to trust us." "That's it exactly, First Officer Nagurski," I said sociably. "If you lazy, lax, complacent slobs want to do something in a particular way, I know it has to be wrong." I turned and found Wallace, the personnel man, standing in the hatchway. "Pardon, Captain, but would you say we also lacked initiative?" "I would," I answered levelly. "Then you'll be interested to hear that Spaceman Quaid took a suit and a cartographer unit. He's out there somewhere, alone." "The idiot!" I yelped. "Everyone needs a partner out there. Send out a team to follow his cable and drag him in here by it." "He didn't hook on a cable, Captain," Wallace said. "I suppose he intended to go beyond the 3-mile limit as you demanded." "Shut up, Wallace. You don't have to like me, but you can't twist what I said as long as I command this spacer." "Cool off, Gav," Nagurski advised me. "It's been done before. Anybody else would have been a fool to go out alone, but Quaid is the most experienced man we have. He knows transphasia. Trust him." I trusted him too far by letting him run around loose. He needs a leash in more ways than one, and I'm going to put one on him. For me, it was a nightmare. I lay down in my cabin and thought. I had to think things through very carefully. One mistake was too many for me. My worst fear had been that someday I would overlook one tiny flaw and ruin a gem. Now I might have ruined an exploration and destroyed a man, not a stone, because I had missed the floor. No one but a reckless fool would have gone out alone on a strange planet with a terrifying phenomenon, but I'd had enough evidence to see that space exploration made a man a reckless fool by doing things on one planet he had once found safe and wise on some other world. The thought intruded itself. Why hadn't I recognized this before I let Quaid escape to almost certain death? Wasn't it because I wanted him dead, because I resented the crew's resentment of my authority, and recognized in him the leader and symbol of this resentment? I threw away that idea along with my half-used cigarette. It might very well be true, but how did that help now? I had to think. I was going after him, that was certain. Not only for humane reasons, he was the most important member of the crew. With him around, there were only two opinions, his and mine. Without him, I'd have endless opinions to contend with. But it wouldn't do any good to go out no better equipped than he. There was no time to wait for tractors to be built if we wanted to reach him alive, and we certainly couldn't reach him 5 or 10 miles out with our 3 miles of safety line. We would have to go in spacesuits. But how would that leave us any better off than Quaid? Why was Quaid vulnerable in his spacesuit, as I knew from experience he would be? How could we be less vulnerable, or preferably invulnerable? "Captain, you got nothing to worry about," Quartermaster Farley said. He patted a space helmet paternally. "You got yourself a self-contained environment. The suit's eye looks into yours at the arteries in the back of your eyeball so it can read your amber corpuscles and feed you your oxygen in the right amount. You're a bottle-fed baby. If transphasia gets you seeing Limburger, turn on the radar and you're air-conditioned as an igloo. Nothing short of a cosmic blast can dent that hide. You got it made." "You are right," I said. "Only transphasia comes right through these air-fast joints." "Something strange about the trance, Captain," Farley said darkly. "Any spaceman can tell you that. Things we don't understand." "I'm talking about something we do understand. Sound. These suits perfectly soundproof?" "Well, you can pick up sound by conduction, like putting 2 helmets together and talking without using radio. You can't insulate enough to block out all sound and still have a man-shaped suit. You have... I know. Then you have something like a tractor or a miniature spaceship. There isn't time for that. We will have to live with the sound." "What do you think he's going to hear out there, Captain? We'd like to find one of those beautiful sirens on some planet, believe me, but..." "I believe you," I said quickly. "Let's leave it at that. I don't know what he will hear. What's worrying me is how he'll hear it, in what sensory medium. I hope the sound doesn't blind him. His radar is his only chance." "How do you figure on getting a better edge yourself, sir?" "I have the idea, but not the word for it. Tonal compensation, I suppose. If you can't shut out the noise, we'll have to drown it out." Farley nodded. "Beat like a telephone time signal?" "That would do it." "It would do something else. It would drive you nuts." I shrugged. "It might be distracting." "Captain, take my word for it," argued Farley. "Constant sonic feedback inside a spacesuit will set you rocking against the grain." "Devise some regular system of interruptions," I suggested. "Then the pattern will drive you crazy. Maybe in a few months with luck I could plan some harmonic scale you could tolerate." "We don't have a few months," I said. "How about music? There's a harmonic scale for you, and we can endure it, some of it. Figaro and Asleep in the Cradle of the Deep can compensate for high-pitched outside temperatures, and Flight of the Bumblebee to block bass notes." Farley nodded. "Might work. I can program the tapes from the library." "Good. There's one more thing. How are our stores of medicinal liquor?" Farley paled. "Captain, are you implying that I should be running short on alcohol? Where do you get off suggesting a thing like that?" "I'm getting off at the right stop, apparently," I sighed. "Okay, Farley, no evasions. In plain figures, how much drinking alcohol do we have left?" The quartermaster slumped a bit. 21 litres unbroken. One more about half full. Half full? How did that ever happen? I mean, you had some left. We'll take this up later. I want you to run it through the synthesizer to get some light wine. Light wine? Farley looked in pain. Not whiskey, brandy, beer? Light wine. Then ration it out to some of the men. Ration it to the men? That's an accurate interpretation of my orders. But sir, Farley protested, you don't give alcohol to the crew in the middle of a mission. It's not done. What reason can you have? To sharpen their taste and olfactory senses. We can turn up or block out sound, we can use radar to extend our sight, but the Space Service hasn't yet developed anything to make spacemen taste or smell better. They're going to smell like a herd of winos, Farley said. I don't like to think how they would taste. It's an entirely practical idea. Tea tasters used to drink almond and barley water to sharpen their senses. I've observed that wine helps you appreciate culinary art more. Considering the mixed-up sensory data under transphasia, wine may help us to see where we are going. Yes, sir, Farley said obediently. I'll give spacemen a few quarts of wine, telling them to use it carefully for scientific purposes only, and then they will be able to see where they are going. Yes, sir. I turned to leave, then paused briefly. You can come along, Farley. I'm sure you want to see that we don't waste any of the stuff. There they are, Nagurski called. Quade's footsteps again, just beyond that rocky ridge. The landscape was rich chocolate ice cream smothered with chocolate syrup, caramel, peanuts, and maple syrup, eaten while you smoked an old mellow Havana. The footsteps were faint traces of whipped cream across the dark, rich taste of the planet. I splashed some wine from my drinking tube against the roof of my mouth to sharpen my taste. It brought out the footsteps sharper. It also made the landscape more of a teenager's caloric nightmare. The four of us pulled ourselves closer together by reeling in more of our safety line. Farley and Hoffman, Nagurski and myself, we were cabled together. It gave us a larger hunk of reality to hold on to. Even so, things wavered for me during a wisp of time. We stumbled over the ridge, feeling out the territory. It was a sticky job crawling over a melting chunk-style Hershey bar. I was thankful for the invigorating Sousa march blasting inside my helmet. Before the tape had cut in, kicked on by the decibel gauge, I had heard or felt something dark and ominous in the outside air. Yes, this is definitely the trail of quail, Nagurski said soberly. This is serious business. I must ask whoever has been giggling on this channel to shut up. Pardon me, Captain, you weren't giggling, sir? I have never giggled in my life, Nagurski. Yes, sir, that's what we all thought. A moment later, Nagurski added, Anyway, I just noticed it was my shelf. Self. The basso profundo performing Figaro on my headset climbed to a girlish shriek. A sliver of ice. This was the call Quaid and I had first heard as we were about to troop over a cliff. I dug in my heels. Take a good look around, boys, I said. What do you see? Quail, Nagurski replied. That's what I see. You, I said carefully, have been in space a long time. Look again. I see our old buddy Quail. I took another slosh of burgundy and peered up ahead. It was Quaid. A man in a spacesuit, faceplate in the dust, 200 yards ahead. Grudgingly, I stepped forward out of the shadow of the ridge. A hysterically screaming wind rocked me on my toes. We pushed on sluggishly to Quaid's side, moving to the tempo of pomp and circumstance. Farley lugged Quaid over on his back and read his gauges. The quartermaster rose with grim deliberation and hiccuped. Better get him back to the spaceship fast. I've seen this kind of thing before with transphasia. His body cooled down because of the screaming wind, psychosomatic reaction, and his heating circuits compensated for the cool flesh. The poor devil's got frostbite and heat prostration. The four of us managed to haul Quaid back by using the powered joints in our suits. Hoffman suggested that he had once seen an injured man walk back inside his suit like a robot, but it was a delicate adjustment controlling power circuits from outside a suit. It was too much for us. We were too tired, too numb, too drunk. At first sight of the spacer in the distance, transphasia left me with only a chocolate-tasting pink afterimage on my retina. It was now showing bare skeleton from cannibalization for tractor parts, but it looked good to me, like home. The wailing call sounded through the amber twilight. I realized that I was actually hearing it for the first time. The alien stood between us and the ship. It was a great pot-bellied lizard as tall as a man. Its sound came from a flat vibrating beaver tail. Others of its kind were coming into view behind it. "Stand your ground," I warned the others thickly. "They may be dangerous." Quaid sat up on our crisscross litter of arms. "Aliens can't be hostile. Ethnic impossibility. I'll show you." Quaid was delirious and we were drunk. He got away from us and jogged toward the herd. "Let's give him a hand," Farley shouted. "We'll take us a specimen." I couldn't stop them. Being in alpine rope with them, I went along. At the time, it even seemed vaguely like a good idea. As we lumbered toward them, the aliens fell back in a solid line except for the first curious-looking one. Quaid got there ahead of us and made a grab. The creature rose into the air with a screaming vibration of his tail and landed on top of him, flattening him instantly. "Shh, men," Nagurski said. "Leave it to me. I'll surround him." The men followed the first officer's example and the rope tying them to him. I went along cheerfully myself until an enormous rump struck me violently in the face. My leaded boots were driven down into fertile soil and my helmet was ringing like a bell. I got a jerky picture of the beast jumping up and down on top of the others joyously. Only the stiff space armor was holding up our slack frames. "Let's let him escape," Hoffman suggested on the audio circuit. "I'd like to," Nagurski admitted, "but the other beasts won't let us get past their circle." It was true. The aliens formed a ring around us, and each time a bouncing boy hit the line, he only bounced back on top of us. "Flat!" I yelled. "Our seams can't take much more of this beating." I followed my own advice and landed in the dirt beside Quaid. The bouncer came to rest and regarded us silently, head on an 80-degree angle. I was stone sober. The others were lying around me quietly, passed out, knocked out, or taking cover. The ring of aliens drew in about us, closer, tighter, as the bouncer sat on his haunches and waited for us to move. "Feeling better?" I asked Quaid in the infirmary. He punched up his pillow and settled back. "I guess so, but when I think of all the ways I nearly got myself killed out there. How far have you got in the tractors?" "I'm having the tractors torn down and the parts put back into the spaceship where they belong. We shouldn't risk losing them and getting stuck here." "Are you settling for a primary exploration?" "No. I think I had the right idea on your rescue party. You have to meet and fight a planet on its own terms. Fighting confused sounds and tastes with music and wine was crude, but it was on the right track. Out there we understood language because we were familiar with alien languages changed to other sense mediums by cybernetic translators. Using the translator we can learn to recognize all confused data as easily. I'm starting indoctrination courses." "I doubt that is necessary, sir," Quaid said. "Experienced spacemen are experienced with transphasia. You don't have to worry. In the future I'll be able to resist sensations that tell me I'm freezing to death, if my gauges tell me it's a lie." I examined his bandy-sprayed hide. "I think my way of gaining experience is less painful and more efficient." Quaid squirmed. "Yes, sir. One thing, sir. I don't understand how you got me away from those aliens." "The aliens were trying to help. They knew something was wrong and they were prodding and probing. When the first tractor pulled up and the men got out, they seemed to realize our own people could help us easier than they could." "I'm not quite convinced that those babies just meant to help us all the time." But they did. First, that call of theirs. It wasn't to lead us into danger, but to warn us of the cliff, the freezing wind. They saw we were trying to find out things about their world, so they even offered us one of their own kind to study. Unfortunately, he was too much for us. They didn't give us their top man, of course, only the village idiot. It's just as well. We aren't allowed to dissect creatures that far up the intelligence scale. But why should they want to help us? Quaid demanded suspiciously. I think it's like Nagurski's dog. The dog came to him when it wanted somebody to own it, protect it, feed it, love it. These aliens want Earthmen to colonize the planet. We came here, you see, same as the dog came to Nagurski. Well, I've learned one thing from all of this, Quaid said. I've been a blind, arrogant, cocksure fool, following courses that were good on some worlds, most worlds, but not good on all worlds. I'm never going to be that foolhardy again. But you're losing confidence, Quaid. You aren't sure of yourself anymore. Isn't confidence a spaceman's most valuable asset? The hell it is, Quaid said grimly. It's his deadliest liability. In that case, I must inform you that I'm demoting you to acting executive officer. Huh? Quaid gawked. But damn it, Captain, you can't do that to me. I'll lose hazard pay and be that much further from retirement. That's tough, I sympathized, but in every service a chap gets broken in rank now and then. Maybe it's worth it, Quaid said heavily. Now maybe I've learned how to stay alive out here. I just hope I don't forget. I thought about that. I was nearly through with my first mission, and I could speak with experience, even if it was the least amount of experience aboard. Quaid, I said, space isn't as dangerous as all that. I clapped him on the shoulder fraternally. You worry too much. Remember to hit the like button to support the channel. Thanks. Captain Peabody by Phillips. Narrated by William Skye. A quick content warning before we start. This story contains scenes of mild violence and torture. If that might disturb you, why not check out another of the many stories on this channel. He carried the monkey of fear on his back for all to see, and until he could shake the beast, he knew he would be a captain in name only. The gavel rapped sharply, and the murmur of conversation throughout the banquet room drifted into hushed silence. The occasion was the 75th meeting of RETSCAP, the Organization of Retired Space Captains. The place, a banquet room in the Empire Club on the 164th floor of the new Empire State Building in Manhattan. The time, approximately 9:30 in the evening, August 9th, 2231 AD. Those present, the 418 members of RETSCAP, or rather 419 including the new member, Captain Arthur Peabody, who had reached his 95th birthday just 2 weeks before, and by doing so had been automatically retired from active service and thereby become eligible for membership while still in the prime of life. Quiet, everybody, the secretary and master of ceremonies, Captain John Evers, said good-naturedly, rapping the gavel again. He turned to the new member, sitting next to him. Captain Peabody, he said in his loud, clear voice, the time has come for fulfillment of a traditional part of our get-togethers, one we all look forward to with great pleasure and anticipation. There was a subdued clapping of hands, then Captain Evers cleared his throat loudly and continued. Each of us here has become a member of RETSCAP only after a lifetime of space travel, much of that time as a captain in charge of the destinies of our crews and passengers and ships. Inevitably, each of us has had some unusual experiences in his time, and we like to talk about them, boring each other to death, no doubt, as we repeat the same stories among ourselves meeting after meeting. So it's always a treat to us to get a new member, and by so doing get some fresh stories to listen to. I am about to give you the floor, and what we would like to hear is the one experience you have had which you think is the most unusual in some way of your entire career. The floor is now yours, Captain Arthur Peabody. Arthur Peabody stood up slowly, a tall man, long-legged and short-bodied in his 7-foot height, his sharply bridged nose and high forehead giving his features the stamp of authority comfortably worn, and waited, a quiet smile on his firm lips, until the applause subsided. Then he began his speech. The one experience that stands out in my mind more than any other really began about 5 minutes after I was assigned to my first ship, the Alabama, when I was given the list of my officers and crew to check over. Halfway down the list I came to a name, Oscar Resnick, and suddenly the thrill of being a captain was gone. For 2 cents at that moment, I would gladly have become a retired space captain before I started. I was 52 years old then, and it had been about 30 years since I last saw Resnick. His rating was still Spaceman First Class, and I knew if he had ever risen higher, he had been demoted again, as was inevitable sooner or later. He was an incurable bully with the worst streak of sadistic cruelty in him I've ever run across. Even the sight of his name on that list sent an instinctive fear through me. Once, when I was still a space recruit, he had whipped me to within an inch of my life and instilled in me the realization that he could do it any time, anywhere. A man like that is slightly mad, or strikes you that way. You stay out of his way if you can, and if you can't, you let him have his way, swallow his insults, do anything to avoid the beating you would get if he took the whim. Live with that for 2 years, as I had 30 years before, and you never get over it. Now I was captain of my first ship, and he was to be one of the crew. And I knew in my heart that if he walked up to me and suddenly reached up to scratch his head, I would cringe and turn pale. I wouldn't be able to help it. And if that happened, it would be the end of me. The crew would think I was yellow, and I was when it came to Oscar Resnick. Oh, he wouldn't do anything that would give me cause to toss him in the brig, nor even anything that would give me cause to fire him, at least a reason that would stand up under a union inquiry if he demanded one, which he would. He would just grin at me knowingly with eyes that told me he thought I was yellow, and hesitate just long enough after an order to make me wonder if he was going to obey, the kind of stuff that could break me down completely in time. And there would be nothing I could do about it. I made a try to keep him off my crew. The dispatcher admitted Resnick had the reputation of being a troublemaker, but if I didn't take him, there was likelihood the Union would call out the whole crew and ground the ship. Then the dispatcher pointed out the fact that the list was short one man, my personal orderly. I hadn't thought about an orderly at all and hadn't chosen one yet. He gave me the list of available orderlies, and I looked it over, most of the names meaning nothing at all to me. Suddenly I ran across a name I knew. I didn't know the man, but I had heard of him, and probably all of you have. The name was David Markham. He was the David Markham, all right, the dispatcher said when I asked him, the one who was kicked out of Space Patrol for abject cowardice. The dispatcher told me the man had been trying for 2 years to get back into space, the Union wouldn't take him, and the only way he could get into service was an orderly to a captain, if any captain took him. The dispatcher suggested 2 or 3 other men he knew personally, any one of which I would probably like and decide to keep permanently. But a crazy idea was running around in my head. It was a clutching at straws, but what it amounted to was this. I had a bully on my crew, a man who had my number and knew how to use it. Why not balance him out by making my one choice on the crew a man who was the exact opposite, an abject coward? Possibly, on some level of thought, I wanted company if Resnick showed me up to the crew, someone who couldn't look down on me because of the simple fact that he was the lowest there was. The dispatcher almost cried with happiness over my choice of David Markham. It turned out he was sorry for the guy and felt only a man with real guts would have the courage to sign Markham on. He would certainly have been surprised if I had told him the truth. I met Markham the next morning at 7 o'clock when I returned to the dispatch office at Spaceport, New Mexico. He was a fine-looking fellow, 25, rather short, just over the 6'4" minimum of the Space Patrol, about 190 mass, blonde, square jaw. I took a liking to him at once. but there was a haunting something at the back of his eyes that never went away even when he was smiling, and he smiled often during the time I knew him, though he never laughed but once, and it was a sound I never want to hear again. But that came much later. I sent him aboard with my bags to get my quarters in order, then steeled myself to check in the crew. You know how it is. You sit at the window and the men come by one at a time. You introduce yourself, fix his face in your mind, size him up, then call for the next man. Finally, it was Oscar Resnick looking through the window at me, his thick shock of sandy red hair glued down, clean-shaven, 6'8", about 240 pounds mass, his brown eyes a little too large, his thin-lipped mouth a little too small, his teeth a little too long. The minute I saw him, the old fear descended. It took him a few seconds to place where he had seen me before. Then he recognized me, and I could see memory flowing through his mind as his wide eyes widened even more, and his thin lips pulled back into a knowing grin. "Well, Captain Peabody," he said, rolling the word captain with his tongue as though flavouring it with contempt. "It's a small world. Fancy." I could read his thoughts as they flashed across his face. He would play a waiting game, taking his time, but it would be a game to his liking. Showing up the yellow streak in a captain. Suddenly, he was completely respectful, almost too respectful. "It is certainly good to be shipping with you, sir," he said. "That's the proper spirit, Resnick," I said. "All right, get aboard. Gate 7. After he had gone, I checked in the rest of the crew, seeing liking and respect in their eyes and wondering how quickly it would change to barely concealed contempt, wondering what Resnick would do to show me up. Like a renegade wolf, he would bide his time, staying out of range until the moment he decided was right. Then he would dart in with a swift attack that would tear open my fear of him for all to see, and dart away again to sit and laugh while my soul withered within me. That's all he would do. That's all he would have to do, and he and I both knew it. In the days following takeoff, I watched the slow build-up with a certainty of knowledge that can only come from personal experience. I knew Resnick's methods. A successful bully must be a shrewd psychologist and know how to capitalize on weaknesses. I watched Oscar Resnick size up this man and that one and go to work on each. It's a subtle formula he used. Wait until you are alone with a man, then trip him when he goes by you, or dig your elbow into his ribs painfully, then claim it was an accident, but in such a way that both he and you know it wasn't an accident, yet nobody else will believe it. Mock him with your eyes and your smile, dare him to do something about it. What can a man do? He can't go running to the mate with the complaint that you are picking on him. He can't bring the thing into the open by fighting you without striking the first blow and being branded the aggressor in an unprovoked assault, and unless he is a professional fighter, your sneering confidence bluffs him out of an open fight at first. Gradually, you establish a fear reaction in him that would keep him from winning a fight even if, originally, he could have beaten you. When you are the victim of that sort of thing, you really have only two courses of action open to you. Try to keep out of his way as much as possible if you have any personal integrity, or kowtow to him, grovel in his presence, sneer with him at his other victims, flatter him, and hope he will direct his sadistic streak elsewhere. Soon 4 or 5 of the crewmen start hanging around with the bully, admiring him too much, laughing too much at what he says, siding with him against others, and even doing a little minor bullying themselves by ganging up on this or that victim as soon as each has recognized the streak of cowardly sadism in the other which binds them together as human jackals. A man like Resnick leaves the strong alone at first, waits until the jackals have gathered around him. When this stage is reached, when anybody who says anything is a yellow stool pigeon, you find the best man in your crew a hospital case with bleeding nose, bruised face, black eyes, and maybe a couple of broken ribs caved in by someone's shoe. After the doctor gives him first aid, you go to the infirmary and ask him who did it. He clamps his lips together and tells you he didn't see who it was. He's lying, and he knows you know he is lying, but can you torture it out of him or punish him for not telling you? No, and there's nothing a captain can do about it. He must have the testimony of the injured party in writing, signed and witnessed, and the code book must be followed specifically in punishing the aggressors, and if the captain does anything at all, he is almost certain to be tied up in court at the first port of call by the punished parties. Even if the captain has provable justification for putting a man in the brig, or fining him, or giving him a demotion in assigned type of work, his ship will be delayed by the trial, and the owners will decide they need a captain who knows how to avoid such costly delays. A man like Oscar Resnick is a social cancer, and I saw the symptoms of his presence on the ship come into being and grow, and I knew he was too cunning and too shrewd to let them get out of hand. Any other captain, knowing all this, would sit back and do nothing, knowing that that was his only safe course consistent with his duty of keeping the ship on schedule. I had to follow this course of action too, but I knew that it was just a prelude, that when Resnick sensed the time was ripe for his purposes, he would get at me. It would be subtle and would only take a minute. It would take place in the presence of the crew. It would be something that would catch me unawares, bring the light of fear into my eyes for all the crew to see. That would be enough. The word would go back that Captain Peabody was yellow. Some of the crew would quit the ship at North Marsport, telling the Union business agent they didn't want to ship with a yellow captain. The business agent would find men refusing to sign on my ship because I was a yellow captain, and inevitably the time would come when I could not keep a full crew. Then the owners would dismiss me, and I wouldn't be able to get another berth as captain. I didn't know how to avoid it. It was only a question of time. When would it happen? Today? Not for 6 months yet? Tomorrow? When? David Markham proved from the start to be an extremely conscientious orderly. My quarters were kept spotless, I had only to lift my eyebrows and he was there ready to obey. How many hours a day he spent wiping up imaginary dust, rubbing non-existent detergent off my eating utensils for the nth time before I sat down to eat, polishing my already mirror-bright shoes, and the 1,000,001 things I didn't even know about, I'll never know. Few orderlies mix with the crew, and he was no exception. Most orderlies either have the personality of a spinster to start with, or acquire it after a few years. He had none of that, but then he wasn't the type that orderlies are made of. There was a tension in him at all times that was so strong it seemed almost visible, a tension that made each minor chore a matter of life and death to him. It was pitiful to watch, and I usually avoided watching him as much as possible. But a captain may not pick up something he has dropped, or do a lot of things that any ordinary man does for himself but which are the traditional duties of the orderly, if for no other reason than to keep him busy. So by necessity, David Markham was with me during most of my waking hours. A pattern of speculation about him grew up in one corner of my mind. David Markham was the type of man you instinctively like and respect, the type that in the service should have climbed the career ladder to an admiralship by the time he was 75. As the days passed, the haunting fear in the depths of his eyes seemed almost to have vanished. If I had not known who he was, I would have laughed at the possibility of his being a coward. Even knowing who he was, I began to doubt it. I thought a great deal about the circumstances brought out at his court-martial, the testimony that proved he had broken cover and run, then grovelled at the feet of his captors, crying and pleading for his life. Later, the enemy had captured outposts they could not have located without his help, proving that he had spilled his guts to save his skin. That had, of course, been in the fuss on Venus with Porter's renegades. I didn't see how there could be any doubt of David Markham's guilt, even though the more I saw of the man, the more unbelievable it seemed. I tried to figure out alternative explanations. I tried to believe them. I wanted to believe. I would catch Markham gazing through a viewport into the subdued silver velvet of infinity, and at the millions of flashing jewels that are the individually visible suns of our galaxy, and the nebulae that are other galaxies, with his tortured soul, for the moment, at peace. I would hesitate, wanting to join him in his quiet mood as I would have joined any other man, then I would steal away, unable somehow to bring myself to create any kind of bond between us. I had, I realized by then, chosen David Markham in the hopes that he might become a tidbit I could toss to Resnick to pacify him and divert him from me. A cowardly motivation, no matter how you look at it. It had been an impulse I was now ashamed of. It haunted me. Because of it, I couldn't bring myself to extend to him a Judas friendship, which is what I felt it would be. We were 40 days out from Earth when Resnick turned his attention to David Markham. I discovered it quite by accident. 10 minutes after my regular sleep period had begun, the first mate saw fit to inform me that an uncharted meteor swarm was going to intercept us in 4 hours, and of course it was my responsibility to determine what precautions should be taken. Under ordinary circumstances, I would merely have rung for my orderly, but I was half asleep and did the more natural thing. I went to the door to his room, next to mine, and opened it without knocking. He had just undressed, getting ready for bed. He stood there startled at my unexpected entrance, and I saw the ugly purple splotch over his kidneys that could have come only from the blow of a fist. I pretended I hadn't noticed it. I merely told him that there would be emergency duty and backed out, sliding the door shut. When he came out 2 minutes later, he gave no indication of whether he thought I had noticed the bruise or not. And for the next few hours I was far too busy to concern myself about it anyway. But I felt as though I had given him that bruise myself, with my own fist, and I was as surely responsible for it as though I had. To make it worse, I realized that despite the guilt I felt, I still hoped that Resnick would settle for a famous coward and leave me alone. While I plotted the courses of hundreds of chunks of meteor iron to search out safe holes through the intercepting meteor group, my thoughts whispered gleefully. All you have to do is pretend you don't know anything, and maybe Resnick will be grateful and leave you alone. Later, trying to get some sleep, I tried to think what could be done. Could I come right out and ask Markham about that bruise? Suppose I did and he told me Resnick had done it, and I used that as an excuse to toss Resnick in the brig? Then the men would throw Markham's reputation in my face and claim it was a cowardly lie, and if I didn't release Resnick it would mean an official investigation at North Marsport on the first leg of my first command. Suppose he told me and I did nothing. Then he would know I was afraid of Resnick. I didn't sleep much. I didn't get much sleep for several days. Coupled with my guilt feeling, my hate for myself, was a growing feeling that striking my orderly was the first step in Resnick's plan to get at me, smoke me into the open where he could find an opportunity to expose me. It was obvious how Resnick had gotten to Markham. It had to be when Markham went to the kitchen to bring my meals, and it had to be with the knowledge of the cook, which meant that Resnick already ruled the crew openly behind the scenes. There was no danger of mutiny or any of the claptrap of fiction, of course. Resnick was no fool and had no insane ambitions other than that of feeding his streak of sadism. A few days later, I noticed a small spot of blood on the back of Markham's shirt. I said nothing, but that evening, after I had dismissed him and he had gone to his room, I took a small flat metal mirror and slid it under his door just far enough to peek in and watch him undress, and I saw the welts across his back. Worse, I saw him crying. He shook with silent sobs while tears streamed from his eyes, and hopelessness and discouragement and friendlessness held possession of him. At that moment, I knew with absolute conviction that the court-martial had been right. He was a coward and would never be anything else. But at the same moment, I suddenly understood him. It was something he couldn't help. I lay in the darkness of my own cubicle, a dull anger growing within me, turning me into a slightly irrational being. There was, I suppose, a sort of self-flagellation to it. A psychiatrist would possibly diagnose it as that anyway. In my own mind, I was responsible for everything Resnick did to David Markham, which meant that by punishing Resnick, I was punishing myself. When you descend to such levels of pure and obsessing emotional thinking, logic gets mixed up quite a bit. I came out of that sleepless sleep period with one thing quite clear in my thoughts. Things couldn't go on the way they were. Oh, sure, I had a sneaking hunch that this frame of mind I was in was what Resnick had been angling for. By now I had invested Resnick with omniscience so that it seemed perfectly logical that he should know I had spent a sleepless night, that he should know I had seen those welts on Markham's back. In my mind's eye I could see him, a sneer on his thin-lipped small mouth, while he waited for me to stick my neck out. I could see his muscular arms covered by freckled skin that covered sleek muscles, dangling at his sides, fingers uncoiled but ready to double into fists, fists that had once beaten me into shuddering unconsciousness years ago, fists that could do it again while slightly mad brown eyes glittered at me, mocking. David Markham served my breakfast, the perfect orderly, quick to anticipate my wishes, so attuned to my habits by now that he almost seemed to read my thoughts before I was aware of them myself. He seemed to have not a care in the world. A cold shower can cover a multitude of inner tortures with a pink glow of well-being. Suddenly, the idea came to me. I would talk to Oscar Resnick. I would plead with him. I would offer him money, my whole salary on this trip. Such men have their price. As captain, I made 5 times more than he. I would give it all to him if he would agree to lay off. All I wanted was to get through my first command without trouble, get back to Earth on schedule, make a good showing. I was, suddenly, pathetically confident that he would agree. A deal like that would have to be discussed in absolute privacy, however. The slightest inkling of it to the crew. In a panic of haste, lest my confidence wane, I skipped my 3rd cup of coffee and hurried to my office. Switching the intercom to crew's quarters, I said with the crisp tones of command, "Mr. Resnick, report to the captain's office," repeating it 3 times as is customary on intercom calls aboard ship. Then I made sure the intercom was off and sat there behind my desk waiting, my heart pounding painfully within my chest, my fingers clenched into white-knuckled fists to keep them from trembling. 5 minutes later there came a polite knock at the door. Composing myself as much as possible, I said, "Come in," in what I hoped was a calm, authoritative voice. The door slid open, and Oscar Resnick stood there, his shoulders almost as wide as the door opening, his space-faded sandy hair neatly combed back, his brown eyes darting around the room in a quick survey and just as quickly masking their triumphant glitter as he saw that I was alone, his thin lips, which had been in a firm straight line, breaking into a satisfied and anticipatory smile. "Come in and close the door," I commanded, my voice breaking into nervous uncertainty on the last 3 words. He stepped inside and closed the door firmly behind him, his eyes never leaving me. When the door was firmly closed, he said, "Sure, Art, old boy." With those 4 words, he took command of the situation. They had been uttered so softly that they could not have sent a whisper over the intercom even if it had been on. He walked toward me until he came to the edge of the desk, then planting his fists on the desk top, he said, "I've been wondering how long it would take for you to call me in for a little talk." He exuded an aura of quiet, contemptuous strength as his eyes flicked over me in speculation. "That's right," I said, hearing the nervous squeak in my voice, not sure whether my comment had any relation to what he had said or not. "I want to have a talk with you. Things can't go on the way they are." Resnick drew back in pretended surprise. "Why, I don't know what you mean, sir," he said. "You know perfectly well what I mean," I said, my voice breaking completely. "This is my first command. My whole future hangs on it. What satisfaction could you possibly get from ruining me?" In that moment, the past descended upon me completely. Once again, I was pleading for mercy where there was no mercy, hoping against hope before those soft, mad eyes, searching for something that could never be there. "Why, sir," he said mockingly, "I don't know what you mean at all. Perhaps the stress of your new duties." "How much would you take?" I blurted desperately. "How much to lay off of David Markham, leave me alone?" "Birds of a feather, huh?" he said. His eyes became thoughtful. "Every man has his price, I suppose." A surge of hope coursed through me. Maybe we could dicker. Maybe it wouldn't cost as much as I was prepared to pay. He scratched his chin slowly, then said, Well, how about your salary for this trip and $5,000? His thin lips flicked back in a grin. And a promise on your part that you will sign me on for the next trip, or turn in your captain's papers. The universe stood still as I saw ruin facing me. There was no way out. No way out at all. I heard myself blurt, "Why? Why? Why?" He leaned over my desk slowly, his fists planted on it once again until his face was scant inches from mine. He whispered, "Because you're yellow, that's why. You never had any business becoming a captain." His hoarse, taunting whisper hung in the silence of the room like the knell of doom. There is a madness beyond madness, of that I am sure. I should have been grovelling in fear. I should have been making a decision to step into an airlock and eject myself into space, a suicide unable to live longer with himself, because what he said was true, and I knew it was true beyond any shadow of doubt. Instead, I heard myself saying, "All right, Resnick, you win." My voice was perfectly calm. It was not me. Whatever it was not me talking. My part of my mind was in a numb stupor, unable to act, unable even to think. I heard my voice say, "It's a deal. You promised to lay off. In return, I promise to turn my salary for this trip over to you when we get paid and to sign you on for the next trip." My voice was perfectly calm, even practical. I felt my lips curve into a calculated and bitter smile of defeat. I heard myself say, "Such an agreement can't be put into writing, of course, but shall we drink on it?" I saw disappointment, disbelief, amazed surprise cross his lean, angular features as I rose from behind my desk. As though in a dream, I turned my back on him as I crossed the office to the liquor cabinet, the prerogative of a space captain. I opened it up with unshaking hands. He followed me, came to stand behind me very close. I lifted out a bottle of scotch, the seal still unbroken, and turned to him. "Scotch?" I asked. He hulked over me, his thin lips stretched into a gleeful grin. "Sure," he said softly, his lips pasted against his stained teeth. He sensed my sudden movement, a movement I was not conscious of dictating, but he was too slow as the full bottle crashed down on his skull, shattering and sending a shower of alcohol over his uniform and the floor. His eyes did not close, but blanked into unconsciousness as he sagged to the floor. I stood there for a moment, blinking down at his unconscious form, not quite believing what had happened. Even in unconsciousness he sent fear icing through my veins. In one mad moment, I had ruined it all. When he recovered, he would be unforgiving, without mercy. For a minute or two I broke down completely, crying like a baby. Then, gradually, a calm settled over me. I turned him over onto his back and pulled his slack arms together. I took off my belt and wrapped it around his wrists until I could fasten the buckle firmly. Then I went to my cubicle and brought back a roll of adhesive tape and taped his lips closed, laughing in a low, mad voice that was not my own. I used the rest of the roll of tape to fasten his ankles together, and just as I finished, he opened his eyes. It took him a few minutes to organize his thoughts and fix his attention on me, his eyes questioning me. I continued to chuckle under my breath. I was mad, conscious of the fact I was mad, and beyond caring. "You have nice eyes," I heard myself say. "Nice soft brown eyes." I examined his scalp with careful concern for a moment. "Good thing," I said. "The bottle broke, so there will be no sign of abrasion that could be proof of anything." I took out a cigarette and lit it with trembling fingers while he watched me. Blowing out a streamer of smoke and jabbing in his direction with my fingers, I said, "I'm learning a few things, Resnick. Already I'm learning. I wonder how much it will take to break you down." I pushed his head back and tried to put my thumb against his eyeball. He closed his eyes tightly, and I forced his right eye open and pressed the ball of my thumb against the exposed eyeball. Not too much, or it will make your eye bloodshot, I said in hardly more than a whisper. Evidence, you know. Who's going to believe that the captain did such a thing? Not even the crew. Sure, they'll agree with you to keep from being beat up. That is, if you have any stomach for that sort of thing when I get through with you. I'm just beginning, you know. I lifted my thumb from his eye and squeezed his nostrils together, watching the terror build up in him, watching his struggles, watching him grow weaker and releasing him at the last moment before he lost consciousness, and watching his chest heave as he sucked in lungs full of air. I just thought of something, I said to him. You wouldn't dare retaliate after I let you go. To strike me would be treason, punishable by life imprisonment, wouldn't it? And what would be your defence? That the captain had tortured you? Who would believe that? Who are your witnesses? See how I have stolen your weapons? I pried his left eye open and pressed against it with a thumbnail. A half-hour ought to do it, I taunted. No marks. I have to be very careful so that an examination by the ship's doctor won't show a thing. In 10 minutes, or was it 10 eternities, he became a quivering mass of flesh. I did things to him that left him too weak to move. At the end of half an hour I pulled the tape off his mouth and listened to him blubber. I took the tape off his ankles and the belt off his wrists. I tortured him some more, and he took it. And when I call for you over the intercom, I said, if you don't come at once, I have you for gross insubordination to your captain. And if you so much as touch one member of the crew again, I'll call you, boy. I'll call you. Finally, I let him go. After he had gone, I trembled like a leaf. Slowly, a little bit of sanity returned to me, and with it a realization of what I had done. Nausea overcame me, and I staggered into the washroom and got rid of my breakfast, then returned to my desk. For hours I sat there while my mind picked up the threads of life and began functioning again. There was still the feeling that Resnick was omniscient, that he would be able to topple me into disgrace. But with it, gradually, came the realization that he wouldn't, that he couldn't. I had used his own psychological weapons on him, building up in him a fear psychosis that he couldn't successfully fight. I had turned the tables. I couldn't really believe it just yet, but I couldn't disbelieve it either. For the next 3 days I went about my customary routines with a calm exterior, waiting for the storm to break, but it never did. Finally, to test it, I deliberately went on a tour of inspection through the ship until I came to where Resnick was working, along with several others of the crew. As I entered the compartment and saw him look up, I saw the instinctive cringing that he couldn't help. In a flash of inspiration, I saw that his sadism was a cover for his own cowardice, a compensation mechanism. I knew then that I had won. After one long, silent moment, I turned my back on him and left the compartment. As I walked by myself to the central tube and pulled myself up to the captain's desk, for the first time I began to realize what being captain meant. It meant a lot of things, of course, but most of all it means facing up to one's command, being in charge. I knew that I would never again be afraid, least of all afraid of Oscar Resnick. Nor would I ever again be afraid of fear. In the future, I might be faced with the problem of a bully on my crew again, but I would know how to deal with him, with his own weapons, the one he used because he would be most vulnerable to them himself. When the Alabama reached North Marsport, Resnick quit the ship. I was glad to see him go. The rest of the crew remained with me, and I had no more trouble during the 5 years I commanded the Alabama. David Markham remained with me as my orderly until I retired, and he is still with me. A few years after the incidents of this story, I had an opportunity to get him a commission, but he turned it down and refused to leave me. Sometimes I think he knows what happened in my office that day that I called Resnick in, but he has never given any hint whether he does or not. You wonder that I am not ashamed to confess publicly to you that I was a coward? You shouldn't wonder. We are all cowards, or fools. I am not ashamed of the fact that once I was a coward. Bravery, in a way, consists of not being afraid of being afraid. Just one thing remains in my story. When I reached North Marsport on that first leg of my first command, I was a captain. I have been one ever since. Thanks for listening. For many more stories like these ones, head to my Substack page. There you can get video, audio, and podcast forms of the 3 free stories a week, plus novelettes and novels for those who subscribe to the paid tier. I've moved there for a more stable platform as a creator, as I can no longer rely on YouTube for that. So if you'd like to help keep this project going, head to storiesfromtheskysff.substack.com, link in the description. See you there!